What's up, team? This is Ro, your best friend at JMSB. So here I was asked a question for ECON 201, Introduction to Microeconomics. Question number 5. Let's have a look. Consider an industry where there are only two firms, a duopoly. The industry demand is given by P equals 100 minus 3Q, where Q is the output of the industry and Q1 and Q2 is the output of each firm. Marginal revenues for each firm are given by the following expressions, and so we're offered the marginal revenues for firm 1 and firm 2 respectively. Both firms have the following total cost function, so the total cost is 150 plus 2 times QI, where QI is either I1 for firm 1 or I2 for firm 2. Lower down, we're offered marginal costs. The marginal costs of each firm are identical, and that should be obvious since they both have the same total cost function. The marginal cost is constant at 2. So let's have a look at required A. In required A, it says to write down the profit maximizing condition for each firm. The profit maximizing rule is a pretty straightforward concept. The way that firms maximize profits is simply by equating their marginal revenues to their marginal costs. So here we're offered each firm's marginal revenue, and lower down we know what each firm's marginal cost is. The way that the firm is going to maximize their profits is simply by applying that rule, which is to equate them. And so if I were to write that down, we'd say that MC1 has to equal MR1 and MC2 has to equal MR2. Obviously we could replace 2 for MC and their respective MRs for MR. So there we have it. That's how we would answer required A. Let's move on to required B. So here it says, express the reaction function for firm 1. What output would firm 1 produce if it expects its rival to produce 20 units? Now the way that we come up with the reaction function for each firm is simply by simplifying the profit maximizing rule and then isolating the firm's quantity. And so I remind you that the way that firm 1 is going to maximize their profits is simply by equating their marginal cost of producing output to their marginal revenue. And the idea now, as I explained earlier, is to replace the MC and the MRs that are offered, to simplify the expression, and to try to isolate firm 1's quantity. So if we were to do that, we know that the MC is 2, the MR for firm 1 is 100 minus 6Q1 minus 3Q2, and now the idea is to bring Q1 onto one side of the expression and to isolate it, to have it there all by itself on that one side. So if we work out the math, we can argue that positive 6Q1 equals 98 minus 3Q2, and that's simply because when I bring this guy over, we switch the sign, we make it positive, and 100 minus 2 is going to be 98. And now to isolate Q1, we can divide both sides by 6 and argue that firm 1's reaction function is 98 minus 3Q2 all over 6. The reason why this is called a reaction function is simply because the rule dictates firm 1's optimal output level when we know what firm 2 is producing. So it is a function that relates Q1's output to that of firm 2. And now that we've done that, in order to figure out how many units should be made if we know that the rival is going to produce 20 units, it's simply a matter of plugging in 20 where we see Q2 and to solve for Q1. And so if we work out the math there, we can argue that Q1 is going to be 98 minus 3 times 20 all over 6. So that should work out to roughly 6.33 if we round to 2 decimal places. So there we have it. That's how I would take care of required B. Let's have a look at required C. Here it says, calculate the reaction function for firm 2, then calculate the Curnutt Equilibrium price and quantities. Now the way that we're going to find the reaction function for firm 2 is exactly the same way as we did for firm 1. We're essentially going to express the profit maximizing rule for firm 2, which is to produce an output where MC and MR are the same. We're then going to isolate firm 2's output So we're going to put Q2 on one side of the expression, and then we're going to try to tackle the latter half of the question. So first, let's come up with this reaction function exactly like we did earlier. And so if I equate MC to MR, I'm simply going to say that 2 equals 100 minus 6Q2 minus 3Q1. And if I isolate Q2, I'm going to end up with Q2 equals 98 minus 3Q1 all over 6. Now, one thing that should be obvious is that since the two firms are identical, they're each going to have the same reaction function. Whatever is optimal for firm 1, the same is really going to be optimal for firm 2. And so now that we have the reaction function for firm 2, let's talk a bit about how to find this Curnutt equilibrium. The idea is to understand that the two firms are identical, they have the same exact reaction function, and so whatever is optimal for firm 1, the same is going to be optimal for firm 2. So at the end of the day, we know that Q1 and Q2 at equilibrium are going to be the same value. Had the reaction functions been different, mathematically you would be substituting one reaction function into the other and solving for the unknown. So you'd be solving the two reaction functions as a system of equations. But in this course, they keep things simple. The reaction functions are always identical, and so this condition has always held in the past exam questions that I have seen. And so, because the two quantities are the same, I can grab one of the firm's reaction functions and simply replace Q2 with Q1, and now there's just one unknown in this expression, and so I should have the ability of solving for Q1. And whatever the value of Q1 is, the same is going to be the value of Q2. So if we work out the math, we can multiply both sides by 6, and so I can argue that 6 times Q1 equals 98 minus 3Q1. I can now bring this guy over and switch the sign, so I'll get 9Q1 is equal to 98, and now I can divide both sides by 9 and argue that Q1 and Q2 are both 98 divided by 9, so approximately 10.89 if you round to 2 decimal places. Try to understand that this is the output of each firm. It is not the output for the market. The market output is determined by the sum of these two quantities. And so the quantity in the industry is really Q1 plus Q2. So it would be about 21.78. Once again, these answers are slightly rounded. Each time I've been rounding to 2 decimal places. Once we've figured out the market quantity, we can figure out the price that is going to be charged. The way that you find the price is simply by taking this market quantity and plugging it into the market demand curve. So we know that price is equal to 100 minus 3 times Q. Where I see Q, I'm going to replace it with the industry output. So it's a popular mistake to put the firm's output here. Sometimes students will make a mistake by putting 10.89 rather than this 21.78. So as a tip, I'd recommend to be careful about that. Whenever we're working with the industry demand curve, it's important to put the industry output. The industry output is not the output of one firm, but rather of all the firms that are operating in the industry. And so if you plug that in, you should get a price of approximately $34.67. So there we have it. That's how you'd find the Curnutt equilibrium price and quantity. So I hope this video helps. Hopefully you guys keep studying for your exam. I wish you guys the best of luck. Please tell your friends about this group if you find this video to be helpful. Row out.